that live? Does that mean I'm live? All right. Welcome to Waters Garden Center. I'm Kevin. Thanks for joining us online if you couldn't make it. Hope you're in a comfortable environment. We're going to talk today about berries, some fruit, and bramble, and some pomegranates. I want to start first with the soil. This, as a qualifier, those that don't know, a lot of new people to the area are encouraged to come to the classes. It's really important, not just to get to know other gardeners, but to save you some time and energy, money, and to be successful so you don't go through the experiment stage. We've got we record all these, and they're in YouTube. So if you decide, oh, I want to grow fruit trees, then you can do the same 4 times over. Go to the Learn button on waters.com and look up the classes on fruit trees and watch them. They'll be offered by 2 or 3 other people, and that'll help you go through the experimental stage. You'll kill a couple things. Hopefully something will take off for you, go crazy, and you'll be the peach expert, on your block or something. And if you have extra tomatoes, I love tomatoes, so bring me a tomato, please. We're not going to get into recipes unless you want some favorite ones. But the first thing to do, we're going to start on the dirt. All of the stuff here, and now there's one more qualifier. This is year 61 for Waters Nursery. And if we bring it here on the lot, it'll grow here. And we're going to try and help you keep from killing it. Okay, because you can kill a plant. Some of these are some of the easiest, what we're going to go over today, to keep alive and to have fruit from. But if it's grown, if it's on our lot, the species and the grower has been picked because it will do well in Prescott or in a zone 7. And that'll give you a little bit of comfort and confidence. We're not going to go into the stone fruit, but most of the nectarines and the peaches that we bring in are self-pollinators. We have charts out there to help you with that. What we're going to talk about today, with the exception of maybe the blueberries, the blueberries are self-pollinators, but they will tell you that they like to be with another blueberry. So another species will always give you some extra production on blueberries. So starting with the soil, we have high pH in the soil, and we have high pH in our water, and we have almost no organic material in the soil. The calcium, when you add the pH to that, locks up a bunch of nutrients. Decomposed granite is full of minerals, and that's what our primary soil is. It's got a lot of minerals in it, but it's bound, chemically bound up. I'm going to try not to get into the science of it, but acid releases that and causes that structure, that molecular structure, to blow up. And those nutrients that are available are more readily available. They can be picked up by the tree. So you want to be adding acid to your soil. And that's my favorite. You can do it a bunch of different ways. Sulfur soil is good for acid. The reason, what's everybody like to put in the hole? Gypsum. The reason it works is because as it's decomposing, it releases acid, and that blows apart that molecular structure that eventually becomes clay and then caliche here. So you can offset some of that and cause the nutrients to be more accessible. When the plant, getting out of the dirt and going into the plant itself, when the plant is balanced pH-wise, then it's working better. Its cells are taking up nutrients easier. And you can actually see like a jaundiced plant whose pH is out of balance. And that's first go to acid rather than going to iron. There's certain cases where you're going to need iron. That's not the class today. So acidify your soil, and you can do that ahead of time. When you know you're going to put berries in a spot, you can crack a bag of mulch over it. The humic in the mulch will break down the acid. It'll start preparing your soil. I know next year I'm going to do berries over here. I'm going to plant a fig tree over here. Put some mulch on the ground and let it start working its way into the soil. The caution is you want to use some workable mulch. If you're going to get free chips, wood chips or something like that, or you've chipped some wood on your lot and you're going to put that down, that'll work, but know that it will pull nitrogen out of the soil to break down. It'll pull nitrogen out of your plants to break down. It will then release the nitrogen, but in that process, it can damage and kill a plant, especially a young plant. And to counter that, if you're going to use your wood chips or get free wood chips from over by the Humane Society, that's fine. Put 3 or 4 inches down, but throw some nitrogen on it. Throw some of our basic fertilizer, the 744 on it, or get some high nitrogen, get it on that chicken scat, something like that. That'll accelerate the decomposition of it, but it will also keep it from pulling the nitrogen out of the ground and hurting your plants. Some of these have pretty shallow roots, so you're watering. We're going to move into watering. Doesn't have to be that intense, but it needs to be deep and less frequent. These things, most of these, in fact, all of them, do not want to be watered 3 times a week. So you have to be careful about your watering system. If you're going to put a gallon on it, 1/3 of a gallon 3 times a week does not equal a gallon a week in the plant drinking world. So you want to make sure that you get enough to get the saturation go down a couple of inches. This is really easy to test too. Once you start watering your plants and you have a plant issue, a water issue, you can dig up next to it. Let your sprinklers and everything go off and then dig around near the plant and see how far down you're getting and how far is it until you get to dust. And are you still getting roots in the dust? Because that means you're not getting enough water all the way down. Easy, and it's not this simple. It's not always. Try not to use always and never. If it's brown and supple, that's too much water. If it's brown and brittle, that's not enough water. And so there's trees, berries, and grapes. They like their drink, but they don't want their toes, as we call their roots, they don't want their toes in moisture all the time and set up rot. It's like putting a plant in a saucer, you know, and all of a sudden you've got a problem with the plant, and you pull it out and the bottom 1/3 of it's rotted because it's sitting in water. The same thing happens in our soil, especially when you have any kind of clay or you're sitting in rock. So you good deep watering that drains. You see grapes that grow on the side of a hill. That's not just because they like the sunlight that it's created by being on the side of the hill. It's the drainage that happens on the side of a hill. So that's part of what we're working with here. The go up the stalk. I'm trying to speak about some universal things before we get into the plants, each individual plant. You have trimming techniques that are really important for producing fruit. And one of the anomalies in this category of fruit is your bramble, or your grape rather. The grape is going to be a producer of fruit on its new vine, okay? This is unusual in the fruiting world. Most of this stuff is second year. This happens to be the lollipop. This is a crazy fast grower and a great table grape. You can make wine out of anything that produces sugar. That's the catalyst for the yeast, the carbohydrate for the yeast. But when you have your red skin, that's going to be your tannic acid. That's the dryness in your wine. But you have to pay attention to your vines. The reason you see the grapevines all short and cut down real close is because they want the grapes to be accessible to be picked, but also the new growth puts on the grape. So you have to identify branches that produce fruit. There are branches that the plant will put out to produce shade for the branches that will produce fruit, and it will put out branches that will produce no fruit and just be growth. That branch isn't necessarily sterile. If you want an arbor and you want the shade for yourself and you want grapes to hang down, you're going to have to let some of those grow a little bit longer to cover the space, and then be diligent about your pruning. It does pay to take stuff off that does not produce. It will be more, you'll be more successful as far as the number of grapes you'll get off of a plant. You see wild grapes and they produce a lot of fruit and nobody is trimming them, but they also take over a tree, they'll choke out plants and stuff like that. It's very, very aggressive. You're trying to get more production on a lower level. So this particular guy, you have to trim pretty frequently or pay attention to what's producing fruit and what's not. The other one that is here, the other grape, both of these grapes are real productive. Like 1 or 2 vines, you're going to have all the grapes that you can stand in year 2 or 3. These are ready to produce right now. And when you're watering these, you have to be careful not to, and I'll reiterate this, don't be watering the leaves. There are problems with fungus and stuff like that. Not so much out of the clouds, but out of the spigot. It's not a fungus that's in your spigot. Your water's not dirty, but your water is heavy and hard. It's got a bunch of, it's high pH and it's high in calcium, and it allows the moisture to sit on the plant in a way that it can produce fungus, and that's problematic. So water at the base, and then trim to produce fruit or trim to produce shade, right? Those are real important when you're looking at them, and you'll only learn that by spending time with the plant. This isn't if you really want to produce wine or you really want to produce table grapes, you're going to have to spend some time with the plants. They will tell you if they've been watered too much or if they've been watered too little. Your first anomaly is brittle or soft brown, and your green could be as simple as acid before you get into your foods, okay? I'll touch on that again in a second. Your bramble, which are going to be your blackberries, raspberries, loganberries, boysenberries. Great. Again, don't water from the top. Don't hose the plant down. These guys are voracious climbers. Well, you have to weave them, but they'll put out, just like the grapes, feet at a time. It's like, you miss them for a couple of days. If they're getting their water, they're real aggressive growers. This plant puts on fruit on the second year is what it's called. So when you're trimming, and it quits putting off fruit on those old tines. So it's unique in that sense. You want to take 2-year-old tines down to the ground so that it will produce more. You don't cut the whole plant down. It'll put up sticks. You tie them up. You get your fruit off of them the next year. You cut that stick down so that it can put up more. You have to be paying attention to the plant. You just can't keep everything and trim to size. So the blackberries, your bramble, okay, stuff that's thorny. You have to pay attention to that if you want to maximize your fruit. Otherwise, you're just going to have this jungle that is really thorny to get in and out of. It's when you see these grown for commercial, it's really interesting. It's not cut back like a grape. They're stalks. There are some that will be advertised as heavy producers, or maybe even a second crop out of them. And you will get 2 crops in a season out of those plants. They're hybridized for that. It's not a genetically modified when you say hybridized. But that old stock will produce on the top in the spring and on the bottom half in the fall. You can cut that off once you learn to identify that. But know that the bramble, then when that stalk is finished, you want to cut it back because that's going to encourage the next year's growth, right? So pay attention to that. This, the raspberries and the bramble, there's some really fun stories in here. So I'm going to go to some of those tales. There is a Mr. Logan that created the loganberry, and he was an attorney in San Francisco area, I believe, and he was frustrated with the fruit he was getting, and so he hybridized. He was an amateur horticulturalist, and he created the loganberry, and it started to produce, and it has different characteristics. Locally, Oak Creek up near Sedona, the Snavely family brought in berries with them, and they mixed with the wild berries, the raspberries and stuff that are starting to ripen now. July and August is when you can pick the wild fruit in the creek beds. And but those are a hybridization brought in with the immigrants, and it's local. So I don't know quite what it's called or if anybody's actually given it a name, but I got a buddy of mine who's 5th generation Sedonan and tells stories about the apples and stuff like that. The Boysenberry, there is a Mr. Boysen, and he took a loganberry and a raspberry and a blackberry, and he wanted a different fruit. And he made some notoriety enough to where people were paying attention to it. And there was this young couple that decided they wanted to open up a farm. Actually, they wanted to sell fruit. It was around Depression time. They wanted to sell fruit and pies. And they started to stand, and it started to become really profitable. And they went and they found this Mr. Boysen, and they were really discouraged because he had like some sticks to give them, you know, and they actually took them back and created and really took the Boysenberry to a new level. And they created pies and jams and stuff like that. And that's Mr. and Mrs. Knox, actually. So they ran with that, and the hybridization of the Boysenberry but there was originally a Mr. Boysen. So remember your stalks, get to know your plants. Your blueberries, they actually do really well here. It's an acid lover, all right? And it does like when they go a little jaundice or green or yellow, I'm going first to acid rather than first to iron. Calcium is another really great source for you. The calcium, calcium nitrate. When calcium nitrate breaks down, it releases nitrogen in the soil, which is your greeny, leafy, and extra limbs. So that's a benefit. Plus the nitrogen, the calcium itself will cause your fruit to taste better. Blossom end rot isn't just a tomato thing. It's squashes and other fruits. Where the blossom leaves the fruit, you'll have a brown spot. That's not a bug. That is a calcium deficiency. And you'll increase. There's also a measure of testing the sugar content in fruits and grapes. It's called Brix. It's real common in hothouse tomatoes. They want to know your Brix level because of the lack of natural environment, and they have to induce it with calciums and stuff like that. But calcium nitrate is a great benefit to what you're doing, what you're trying to do when you're producing veggies and fruits, especially on the brambles and the berries. To touch on the nitrogen for a second, you can get a lot of growth with fish emulsions or some other natural nitrogen. Your chicken's scat has been broken down appropriately, and sometimes you get a phenomena of my plant is huge and green and I'm not getting any fruit. It's actually growing too fast and it's forgetting to bloom. So you got to throttle back on the nitrogen and give them a little bit of phosphate. And I'll go over the fertilizing here in a second. But this is one of the species where, yes, I can produce a lot of fruit by myself. I would really like to have a companion blueberry. You can get a couple of the same. It's better if you get a couple. Just be aware of that and pay attention to your bloom times. Get to know your plants. If they're not blooming at the same time, they can't cross-pollinate with each other. So early, late, middle fruit production is how you're going to read that label. And it's going to tell you that it doesn't need a cross-pollinator. And it literally doesn't, but it will produce more. There are some things in this we can learn from the science of it. We try and figure out why things work, but there's really common things that are so very simple. Someone will bring us a plant and it's doing really great, and I'm wondering why they're bringing it. Well, they're just because they want to show me because it's doing really well. What should I do? Well, don't do anything. You know, if it's doing well, don't change things.
Are the grapes self-pollinating too?
They are. But it's not uncommon for people to come in here and buy. Well, I get things in fives. So 5, 15, 20, 25, 30 of different plants, whether they're flowers or they're grapes. It's not uncommon for someone that wants to start their orchard, has decided they've read all their winemaking books and they're ready to go, they'll buy all that I have. And you get this just crazy abundance. They are cyclical, like every other fruit. The wood trees, especially, you'll get a great big bumper crop, and then you won't get as many, and then you won't get as many, and then you'll get a great big bumper crop. And it's cyclical, but 2 or 3 vines for table grapes in a yard, unless you want more species. Get one that you haven't heard of just to entertain yourself, because you're going to want to get to know the plants. And but yeah, you don't need 10.
When you say they pollinate, and do they cross-pollinate? Do I need pollinators? I live in Prescott Valley. I've got a garden. I got flowers. I got all kinds of stuff, and no pollinators.
Well,
Bees whatsoever,
yeah,
and they won't allow me to have
yeah,
bees.
right.
So how do you?
So the question is, how do you get pollinators, and what qualifies as a pollinator? Just having flowers in your yard, that's very different. How do I get pollinators into my yard? Well, having the flowers is a great thing. There is a difference between having to have a cross-pollinator, like a Honeycrisp is not, Honeycrisp apple doesn't pollinate itself, but it will pollinate a Fuji, which may be a self-pollinator. So I encourage you, when you're looking at your labels on the pollination side to produce fruit, get one of a self-pollinator and then get another one that you like. You want to like them both, because on that cycle where you hit a lot of fruit,
You still need bees.
you still need bees. You still need bees.
So what do I do?
Go buy some bees.
I can't.
Yeah,
You can't have them pressed out. I just checked yesterday.
yeah.
They're a nuisance. Kids are a nuisance too sometimes, but you can have those.
Well, kids are like, he says kids are a nuisance and bees are a nuisance. So which is better to have to help cross-pollinate? You could probably give the kids some feathers and go around and do it yourself, and touch the flowers and stuff. But
it is a problem for us. So what do we do?
encourage your farmers to not use the pesticides that kill bees. There's no answer for that. Yeah. So, so let's move into the figs, which is a fun one also. This guy is not in need of a pollinator, and he does bloom on last year's fruit, last year's limbs. So you want to trim, knowing that you're going to cause it to put out a branch that next year is going to have the fruit. And so you see this green up here is new growth. The brown is last year's new growth, and that's what has this year's fruit. So you can trim some of the fruit off. Figs are one that don't get so laden unless you're in an environment where they're really, really productive. But you can crop these guys really heavy. You can cut them really severely. I personally, when I'm living in an area like this where you have a good freeze, nature's going to trim it pretty well by itself. So and it's one of the last things to come out, and it's very difficult to measure where it is. So the temperature, consistent temperature, has to be a certain heat for a consistent amount of time. It's not, you very rarely will see growth on this before Mother's Day. Any green at all, you'll think your tree is dead, and you just have to wait. And then what I'll do is I will see little nodes on it that will be the branches, and I'll start on the top and I'll cut down until I get to green. Are you following me? Don't just go and lop it off and you think, oh, I just cut off a bunch of live stuff. Start cutting a little bit at a time. And this is again, you're going to want to get to know your plants. And so you will figure it out. And I always wait until after Mother's Day. I give it a little extra time. It's not going to hurt anything, but I know that last year's branch is this year's fruit, and next year's branch is next year's fruit. So I want to make sure I'm producing branches and how I'm cutting it. So instead of cutting off this whole branch here, I'm going to try and cut off as little as possible, because each place that there's a scar for a leaf is potential for a new branch. Yeah, so how do you keep them from dying is the question. He has a big one that survives and smaller ones that come up, die back down to the roots. That's a problem with altitude and winters. So I have the same. I thought I lost the Chicago Hardy. I went ahead and bought another one and planted it, and the old one came back. So, and it came back like knee high. Well, I just lopped it off and was going to buy a new one and see if it came up from its roots. I wasn't expecting it to come up high. So don't be discouraged by that. You can mulch them. You can wrap them. You can do both. But again, don't use green mulch. Use a bagged mulch that's already broken down. Wrap them with burlap. And however warm it gets, don't let them kid you and don't take off the burlap until they start coming out a little bit. In the figs, that's a Chicago Hardy, and it's supposed to be Chicago Hardy, like zone 3 or 4, right? That just means that the roots aren't going to die on you, not the plant itself. Yes, sir.
How tall do those normally grow?
Well, in Phoenix, they're 25 feet. Up here, you'd be really lucky to get a 10-footer. How tall do they grow is the question. You have a 10-footer. There you go. Don't change whatever you're doing. So this one is a hybrid. Phenomenal, all right? The cultivars are having fun with it. This is a 2 to 3 foot tall fig tree. That's all it's supposed to get. And you can see all the fruit that's on it, right? This is a tree that makes a great a potted plant, because you're going to want to bring it in. This is not going to be able to handle our winter. So you're going to literally treat it as a house plant on the back porch in bright sun during the summertime. In order to be able to do that and have it survive in the summer, you have to have enough dirt so that you're not cooking the roots in the sunshine. It's really easy to do, getting the dirt too hot. Don't put a saucer underneath this plant, because its roots do not want to be standing in moisture. You want to keep it drained. You want to water it heavy, even if it's in a pot, and let it drain real good and let it go almost dry. But get on a schedule of like every 7 days, I'm going to check this plant. If that's not working for you as far as it getting too dry, then go to 5 and work your way back. When you're dealing with keeping them in pots and in the ground, I would like to just address that for a second on your watering habits. I call it watering 3 times, and you're doing it once a week. So you go up to any potted plant and you put water on it, and water runs out of it. And you think, oh, wow, it doesn't need a drink. Well, the ground inside, the dirt inside the pot is not hydrating. So that's one. And then you come back a couple minutes later and you hold it there a little bit longer. And you'll see water will still come out of the pot, but it will take a little longer for it to do so. That's because the dry sponge that is your mulch that it's growing in has now absorbed a little bit more water. Then you come back a 3rd time and flood it. And that's your one watering for the week. And if it's in the ground, it's the same thing. You'll walk up to it and you'll hit it and water will run off. Well, you can build a dam or a well if you want. You can put a nice layer of mulch on top of it, but you're going to want to water them deep, like that 3 times. You'll just go down the row and give it a minute, and then go down the row and give it some time to soak in, and then just do the last one slower, even if it's running off. This is a great little plant, and it'll produce a lot of fruit for you. I also have some really fun dwarf nectarines that are left, but you can put those in the ground. And that's a 7-footer maybe, as far as a stone fruit's concerned. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, you're gonna have to bring it inside into some sunlight, not just into the garage in the darkness. It's gonna want to continue to grow. Will it survive being in a greenhouse? I'm not understanding the question. Yeah. But it depends on how, she wants to know if it will survive in a greenhouse that's not heated in the wintertime. And that, if it gets below 40, it's dead. So I don't know if you can keep a greenhouse warm in the winter without a heater, but it's another class. I'll show you how to build a greenhouse. Inside of this, you have a pomegranate, which is typically more frequently known as a desert or a tropical fruit. These do really well up here. And it's got the same needs. You don't want it standing in water. You want it to be acidified. It has the same symptoms. If it goes yellow on you, I would go with acid first before I would put nitrogen or iron on it. A couple of things people don't understand about pomegranates is they do have a small thorn to them. It's not a really friendly plant. It's a very pretty plant. It's really neat to hide a corner, especially when they're in bloom. They're spectacular. The flowers on the edibles are really neat. There are fruitless, and that means less fruit, not completely fruitless. And in the case of the pomegranate, it tends to be a flower that leaves a fruit. The fruit is smaller. It has the pretty flower, but the fruit's not edible. It's like the bitter orange down in the valley. So, but these guys will produce. Be careful with this plant because when it goes dry is when it goes naked or dormant is when you want to trim it, and you want to trim for size after it blooms because it's going to put fruit on last year's growth, and after it finishes your fruiting, you can take some branches off. You'll get some new branches off of it that will set fruit in the spring, and then you thin out the inside when it's dormant. When it doesn't have any leaves on it, it's real easy to see the stuff that's crossing and getting in the way and fighting for sun, and you can take out those tines. But I would do the same thing on my fig. Sometimes because they freeze back far enough, you end up with this real thick, low mound, and you got to go in and take out your dead wood. And sometimes that's enough of a thinning, but sometimes it's not. You have to just sacrifice some branches. More branches doesn't always mean more fruit. You can have more branches that are more productive if you treat them right. So we'll talk about a couple of the, here's a fun one. I love this term. Thornless. Be careful of thornless, because sometimes it really just means less thorns, not without thorns. And so it's kind of, you have to just be aware that when you reach in there, these are really fun for those kids that are a little irritating next to the bees. You can take their gloves away and send them into the briar patch to pick berries, and however that works for you. So a couple of problems that you'll encounter with our altitude and our climate. You may encounter during this time of the year mold. You've got white spot, black spot. You've got fungus that grows on these, especially the bigger leaf ones, the softer leaf ones. I'm very careful with how I treat my grapes. I make dolmas out of the fresh. When you find a branch or two, when you're going to do your trimming and you got some branches that have fresh leaves on them and you don't think that's going to produce fruit, or you don't want the vine to go that way, dolmas are like Greek tamales. You're wrapping your food with a soft grape leaf, and you cook it, and then you put it in lemon juice and olive oil. But that limits what I can spray on them, because I'm going to eat this leaf, right? And you have to be careful about that. The fungicides for those softer are more your, copper sulfite. This is called copper soap. Be very careful about using soaps and oils. People want to be really clean. As an aside, your horticultural oils, and I have some here to talk about a little bit. The soap, which everybody considers natural, they put soap on their plants. There's a neem oil that's often used as a sticking agent. It'll suffocate the bugs. It's not toxic to them so much as it is a suffocating agent. These are use them very sparingly, if at all, during the summertime. The oil and the heat don't mix with a plant that's trying to breathe through its leaves. You can burn it with the sun. You can clog its pores. It's counterproductive. If you have something you want to kill and you need to kill it, you need to get some real toxins on it and kill it. Oftentimes with these soft leaves as well, the tender leaves, you run into caterpillars. And the caterpillars can be real aggressive. It's like overnight you'll see the damage on a tree. And that's a BT. And yeah, it's Bacillus thermius or something that sounds like a dinosaur name or something. The Latin name it stands for, its initials are BT. You want your caterpillar sprays to contain BT. And it's a, doesn't affect vertebrates. It's for non-vertebrate critters. So you get the spraying for these or any of these other chemicals is done in the evening so that you don't get sunlight amplified on the leaves. And like 7:30 now, you know, the sun's going down, but you can still see well enough. And you get the bark under the leaves, you get it dripping wet, and then in about 3 days you repeat. And you can do that with your fungicides or with your caterpillar sprays. And you catch things in different stages. In the case of the molds and the fungus, in different stages of sporing, and in the stages and larvae in the eggs and stuff like that with your caterpillars. So you come in a couple of days later and doing it again is just real effective. But get the bark, get the base. It could be residing in the mulch and sporing up or crawling up the plant. So you want to make sure that you are paying attention to that. On your fertilizers, we do advocate our 744, which is the stuff that we've developed for quarterly feeding. When you see all these flowers that we're sitting in, the term in the business is called pushing. And you're on a drip system in a grow room or a great big commercial greenhouse. And most of the plants are on a balance, like a 10-10-10 or something like that, that is diluted way down. And when the plant gets good and thick, then they spike the center number, which is phosphate, until they go into full bloom. And then they send them to us because they have fruit on them or flowers on them and they're easy to sell. Having said that, when you take a plant home and it's in the mulch that has been absorbing this fertilizer while it's in its growth state, you're going to start putting water on it, and then you're going to be rinsing out that food, and you're going to be putting it in the ground. The plant is still eating, so it still needs the food, and you're rinsing it out. So you want to get something granular on the ground on a quarterly basis to have them have access to it. So it breaks down and works its way into the soil. And whether you're using a drip or you're coming by with your hose, it's keeping it moist enough to where the roots can get to it, all right? In your planting, you don't want to put too much mulch in the hole. The plant is usually grown in mulch, so you have a bucket full of mulch, and you have a hole in decomposed granite or our native soil. It's about a third. You just want to change the structure of the soil enough to where the roots can get out into it. You put your extra mulch on top, or you make your dam out of it. And as that decomposes, it works its way into the soil. It's keeping the evaporation down and the temperature of the soil down, and it's working a little bit slower that way. If you go with too much mulch in the hole, you'll end up with dry rot in the summer because you'll have air pockets as that mulch decomposes, and you'll keep that mulch wet and the heat, you'll have dry rot. And plus your roots can get cold in the wintertime. I'll get right there, just a sec. So when following the example of your growers, this is our flower power. The key ingredient, all three ingredients are important. But the flower power, nitrogen, as I said, is your green and your growth, right? Phosphate is your center number. The rhyme, if you will, that we use to remember this is up, down, all around. Well, the phosphate is your flowering food. It's a root food that's side effect is flowers, or it's a flowering food that side effect is roots. You want to feed your plant. If you want it to bloom and produce fruit, you've got to feed it phosphate. If you want it to go to sleep and have a healthy winter, you want to feed it phosphate. You give it some phosphate in the fall, and you can do that as just superphosphate, which is a granular, and hose it in. And your winter feeding, or you're going to want at least once in the middle of the winter, even though they're just sticks, you're going to want to feed and water the roots so that the roots are doing something. It's the difference. That's the difference between thriving and surviving. You can actually just freeze dry the roots if you leave it alone in the dry, dusty soil, and we get some permafrost. You get a little extra cold. They don't mind the cold in the ground, but they want the moisture, and the roots want to be active during the wintertime. So make sure you're feeding these guys, and feed them some phosphate in the fall, and feed them some phosphate in the spring. And you can do that readily by doing about twice a month, once every 2 weeks. Treat it like a hanging basket, or put some granular phosphate in it. Spike that phosphate a little bit to get them to go. If you have some jaundiced look, this is 12 on nitrogen, so it'll green up your plant as well. But it's not going to green it up and make it grow so fast that it will forget to bloom, which is one of the other symptoms that you have. Yes, sir.
You were talking about the poor native soils here. Does it make more sense, instead of trying to amend it and so forth, does it make more sense to just dig your hole and rather than putting the native soil back in around the plant, just use garden soil and back to garden soil and look at here?
Well, there's reasons you don't want to do that, but that's a good. I'm going to repeat the question. Thank you, Ken.
Nobody even here can hear what the man's saying.
Right. So the question is, do you just, because our decomposed granite is considered bad soil, do you just remove it and then backfill it with perfect soil? Is that better than working with the native soil? And the argument on the science side is no. If you have the hole too perfect, then you run into moisture problems. You can get root rot because it won't retain as much, it'll get soggy on you. And when that heats up, then you'll get funguses and stuff growing in the soil. You won't have the benefit of all the minerals that are in the decomposed granite. It's actually really good dirt. The stuff that you're adding, the potting soil, which could be used as a raised bed mix or too much mulch, as that decomposes, that's going to leave airspace, but it turns to acid, which will cause the decomposed granite to be better dirt. It's actually really good nutrient-wise. Many times I see this where you can't identify the problem, and what we'll go to is adding sand back to it. So if you have a plant like this, again, remember that this is grown in all mulch, and you put that in the hole, you already have a hole full of mulch. And then what you're doing is the extra that you're excavating for your hole, you're mixing bagged mulch with that decomposed granite. So you already have you're already placing a lot of mulch in the hole with just what's in the bucket. So yeah, you want to do, and I don't do if you've already done that, and I've done this, there's one, and it's a common error from people who have come from elsewhere. And I came from a river valley in Texas, where if I dug a 20-foot trench that was 3 feet deep and I pulled out 4 or 5 rocks, it was like, wow, it was an anomaly. Look at these rocks I found underneath my big pecan trees, right? Well, you had to add mulch or you would just get muddy clay. Up here, when I did that, and what I found was I had too light of a soil, and I was going down into the creek bed, and I was getting buckets of creek bed sand and pouring it, decomposed granite, and adding it back on top of my plants. And you'll notice this when you're having a hard time and you can't identify what it is, and you'll go and look at this area. It's usually about 2 or 3 years after you've planted it. This mulch has broken down and left the scene. It's been washed down into the soil, and you will end up with air pockets around your original root ball. And it's not a bad idea to pour some sand around it with your quarterly feeding of your 744 and water it in to melt the 744, and you'll see all the sand disappear. That's because it's finding the air pockets that the mulch breaking down has created. It's really important, especially on some of your bigger buckets. Like you get a 25-gallon bucket aspen, and in a year or two, you'll start developing problems because you'll have air pockets around there where all that mulch was that's been washed out.
We have Caliche, we live in Prescott Valley as well. So we have the Caliche, almost the adobe type soil.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what we've done is we've dug a bigger hole than necessary, but we've maintained some of the caliche in there because that's the natural soil that the roots are going to go into, and then we put our filler in.
So she has caliche. She's in an area of Prescott Valley that the clay is turned to a pan, and it's hard. And inside of her observation is that she's leaving a little bit of that caliche because it's the natural stuff that the roots are going to go into. And that's exactly what we want to have happen. We want to add like a third mulch to the native soil. If you do sometimes you'll find a vein or a bed of that where it's hard to break through. I've had augers just bounce on it about a foot down, and we had to get pry bars and break it. And then you'd go, and we have a level like this, and then all of a sudden you're back into sandy. So your acid, again, it's going to blow apart that molecular structure. Gypsum does not melt rocks, okay? The acid in the gypsum breaks apart the molecular structure that causes the clumping and the clay that eventually becomes the caliche. But that's a perfect observation. You want to leave some of it, but get acid in there. And you can get acid in there through, and again, all right, I do need to make a point here. We're not in the business of showing plants. We're in the business of selling plants. And so I am selling the fertilizer in the plants. We did bring in and save a bunch of grapes so that you could take some home, so that they wouldn't sell before we had the talk, right? So they're out there. The 744 that we have developed has acid in it from cottonseed casings. We found that to be a really good slow release to improve your soil. Once you add a mineral to an organic fertilizer or an organic potting soil, once you add a mineral, they won't let you call it organic anymore. So you can add calcium from dolomite, which is oyster shells, and they won't let you call it organic. So just read your labels and be aware of what you're feeding your plants, because you're going to end up eating it. Yes, sir. We do have a sign up here, and what this will do is it will give you a recap of today and get you on pertinent information. We don't give it out to anybody. You're not going to get one of the fertilizer companies sending you solicitations for anything. So if you want,
Talking about I've been sending links to the people that are watching online. Kevin, if you sign this sheet, you'll get those same links to the people online if it gets. Question often comes up, oh, well, I'm already part of your garden club. You still need to sign up. It only goes to the people that sign the sheet today.
Kevin,
yes, sir.
when you say add sand, can you get sand at the Home Depot and throw that?
Oh, that's a great question. Can you add sand from home? Do you want to go to a big box store or a hardware store and buy sand? Usually that play yard sand or the sand that's used for making concrete with is too clean, in my opinion. You can buy a topsoil, a bagged topsoil, which should be the finest of the mulch mixed with sand, and it's used for leveling out lawns, but it's a great additive below a plant that's been there too long. If you want what I call green sand, as the rivers run through our properties during the rain, the weight of the stones is separated based on their specific gravity. And you'll see bars, you'll see a sand bar, you'll see a riprap bar, you'll see a pea gravel bar. Go to the sand bar, pull the weeds out, put that in a bucket and pour it on your plants.
Yeah, but I don't have that in my yard. So
Yeah.
Do you have sand, soil?
Yeah, do our bagged topsoil. Yeah. Pardon me. That's the finest of the dust from our mulch, the company that makes our mulch, with sand added to it. It's a great additive to pour below a tree after it's been in the ground a couple of years. And again, you'll see it just disappear when you go to water it in. Yes, sir.
We made a nice raised garden.
Uh-huh.
Seems to be doing pretty well. Would that be a good stuff to just keep the level up because, over time it's going to pack or whatever and shut down?
Yeah, so we have a question about a raised garden, and should we be adding the sand combo to that? And I have to ask a couple of questions before we go there. Does it have air underneath it? Is it an elevated space, or is it raised and the roots can go to the ground? So the roots can go to the ground. What you end up with, many of the potting soils, including ours, double as raised bed mix, and there's not any real sand in that. It's a great growing compound in an isolated area, not for heavy-rooted vines and trees and stuff, but really good for your veggies that you probably going to water every other day. And but yeah, mine gets too loamy. All the heavy stuff falls to the bottom. So yeah, the sand is really good. I have a particular habit of not tilling my raised beds. After like year 2 or so, I'm adding to the top, and when I plant, that is enough tilling for me. I'll dig it much like I plant a tree. I'll dig the space a little bit bigger, and I'll put 4 inches or so of topsoil on it, or mulch, or whatever is needed, and getting to know the bed and how it's been producing. That'll give me an opportunity to see how deep my water is going. And I advocate you water the bed, not just if you're doing veggies, water the whole bed. You can water the plants, especially when you're doing tomatoes and vining, your zucchinis and stuff. When you're going to add some calcium nitrate to it, you're going to throw it right at the base of the plant, and you're going to dissolve it with your hose. But get the whole thing wet. Come back in 45 minutes or so with your little spade and dig in a place next to a plant and see how far down you go till you're hitting dust. You will be surprised. It's amazing how little the water goes down. And you'll talk to people and say, oh, I get great tomatoes, but when I pull the plants up at the end of the season, I can see the roots only went down that far. The roots go as far as you water.
Question.
Yes.
We have the most beautiful climbing green beans that my husband planted, and they went up just beautiful. But no beans on them. They're just green as can be.
Mm-hmm.
A little critter came in and ate all the bottom part of them, but the stem is still okay. They're not producing anything. They're just there.
So she has some climbing green beans. The plant's real big and beautiful. Something ate part of the bottoms. The stalks are okay, but no beans. Phosphate. You want to get phosphate on them. You want to not nitrogen with phosphate. You want to get phosphate on them. And there's a superphosphate, which is a granular, and that will cause the tree to want to bloom. So you've got a really healthy amount of nitrogen in that soil that causes things to grow green and fast and tall, and it doesn't slow down enough to bloom. Not an uncommon thing, even with tomatoes.
And you have the phosphate.
Yes, sir. You can get a small bag. It's called superphosphate. Bone meal, blood meal. There's a couple of other things. Just like people say, don't buy the calcium nitrate, just grind up your eggs. Well, that's good for next year. You want it to happen now. You get the granular product. Yes, ma'am.
I have green table grapes that plants I've been in 11 years. I even planted. I've got a lot of leaves and maybe like 3 or 4 bunches of grapes. They're not producing.
So she's got a green table grape. The tree is probably 11 years old. The vines are probably 11 or so. She's owned it a few years, and it's just not producing. But it's a big vine. So that's a point in case, especially with grapes, where if you can identify the branches that are not producing, you want to cut them back. But she's got a growth issue. It's growing too fast, and she needs to balance out her fertilizer. So what I would do is I would get some acid in that underneath that plant, and I would get some phosphate underneath that plant, and I'd give them a deep watering, and I'd cut them way back. If you want it for shade on certain areas and stuff like that, you can leave those tines, but go in and just take a bunch of it out.
I had called one of the wineries over wherever, and they said it's different trimming table grapes than it is wine grapes.
It is.
I'm certainly not very good at that.
Well, you'll pay attention to the new growth after you've cut it back. Now the vine is yours. It's no longer something you've inherited. You're going to cut it way back, and you're going to own the new growth. You'll be able to pay attention to that.
So would you cut it back now or wait for the fall?
Well, if it doesn't have grapes on it, cut it. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. Okay, I planted some bear grape
Yeah.
Is it better to plant bare root or a bigger plant?
Well, okay, so she's got some bare roots and she's not having any luck with it. The bare root is a real, you really have to want to make it happen. And there can't be any delay between when they show up and when you put them in the ground or when you put them in a pot. I have done a lot of bare root, and what we have done is we've staged the pots. So we get them to root out before we put them in the ground.
Okay, that I did. I got them to grow before I put them in the ground.
Okay.
But it's like every single time, as soon as I put them in the ground, they all die.
Well, so that is, yeah, it's a watering issue or the quality of the soil you're putting it in. Maybe you bury them too deep, maybe you bury them too shallow. There is a line where you don't want to cross on the depth. The only thing that you can successfully bury deep is tomatoes. Everything else, you want to be very careful about where it sets in the soil. And it's possible that once you've moved it from a pot to the ground, you still have a hole full of potting soil instead of some good dirt. And so if you go to visit your new friend that lives in Prescott Valley and get some of the clay soil and add it to the top of it and let it break down and add to your mulch.
Yeah, come on over.
Yeah,
We're up in Calder, and it's more of like a silk.
right.
Yeah.
Well, you have the Paulden, and people don't realize this, but Paulden and Yavapai Hills are volcanoes. And you have dolomite, which is harder than granite, and you just have little pockets of silt. So you really have to break it up and bring in dirt. And that's going down in the creek bed and mixing it with some good mulch or potting soil. Yeah. I'm thinking the hole's too perfect. It's all potting mix or all planting mix and no dirt. I could be wrong without seeing it. It's hard to take. Yes, ma'am.
My husband dug a hole outside to plant some sage, that purple sage Russian, and he put water in it to see about draining.
Mm-hmm.
If it
Came
won't drain.
back 2 days later, it's still there.
So the question is, he dug a hole and he's got standing water. There is an experiment when you're in a clay area where you dig your hole and you fill it up with a hose and you see what your percolation is. And that's a great test even if you're in a real, my house that I sold, I'm now in Prescott Valley. I was up on Copper Basin. So it was all granite and decomposed granite. So I was having a hard time with it retaining any water. Now I'm in that standing water in a new pot. What I do with that is I will I'll dig my hole, and then I have a pry bar, and it's like 6 foot and it's heavy, and one end's pointed, one end's flat. And I'll dig my hole bigger, not deeper, and I will go in and I'll punch holes in it and around it, and I'll pour acid in those holes. This is a soil amendment. It's not a fertilizer. It's very hard to burn. And then I will plant my plant and be careful and just watch my watering. Get a moisture meter.
So then you put this stuff in there and then plant your plant. This won't burn the plant.
Correct.
And
Don't plant it in a handful of this,
Yeah.
but you're pouring the acid into those holes around your hole. And as that dissolves, it'll start breaking that up and you'll get a little bit more flow.
Yeah.
Unless you have some sort of hill, and you can do a French drain is the other technique, where you can dig a trench lower than your hole and fill it full of gravel. And then it will slowly, as the mulch that you plant in breaks down and helps you break down the dirt a little bit, your standing water will run off down that little.
so your plant won't drown waiting for that to take effect.
Correct. Well, that's up to you. You have to watch it. There is a technique. If you don't want to buy a moisture meter, get a thin piece of rebar. And I don't know if anybody bakes, but you run your toothpick or your skewer into your loaf of bread or your biscuit, and if it comes out with pieces stuck to it, there's moisture. More moisture, less moisture, whatever you're baking to, same treatment in the ground. You can get a longer moisture meter and stick it down in there and see where it reads on the bottom of the hole. You can tell whether or not it's sitting in water. I personally use a piece of rebar, and I run it down in the ground next to where I planted something outside of the root ball, so I'm not tearing up roots every time I do it. in that new area. But I planted it, so I know how deep I need to go, and I'll pull it out, and I can look at that and tell where my moisture is. There's times when I had to move a tree that I planted. I realized I put it in the wrong place. It's in my yard. I want it in a different spot. I am the one watering it. It's not on drip. I'm certain I'm giving it enough water. And I'll dig that guy up, and it is dust. The bottom half is dust. And it's just confounding me. So we're all subject to it. I kill stuff all the time. So
I have a question about tomatoes.
thank you. So we're going to wrap it up. We're going to take a few more questions. Thanks for tuning in online. And Ken will get everything out to you about what we discussed and links to stuff to do some extra homework. Yes, ma'am.
I went out to pick the tomatoes. We have the early girls, and they've been doing fine. And now all of a sudden, the leaves on the bottom are starting to die, yellow and blue. And I reached in to get a tomato, and I felt moisture, and I thought, ooh, what's that? And I pulled things away, took that tomato off. Something's been eating it, and I couldn't see the tomato worm. I was looking for that.
It's probably a bird telling you it's ripe.
Really?
Yeah. When they get ripe, if there's a hole in it from the bird, they'll taste it. If they don't come back, it might be still too green.
It's been chewed on both sides, and it's way up underneath the plant. So
Yeah, it could be a bird. It could be a mouse. You know, there's a lot of things that like your tomatoes. Doesn't have to be a horned worm. And the horned worm, by the way, is the butterfly, the hummingbird moth. So it becomes a really pretty. The thing you need to remember about your moths and stuff is that when they're in that larva stage of not in the chrysalis, but in the caterpillar stage, they're only eating. That's all they're doing. And then when they go into the moth stage, they might take a little nectar to keep their energy level up, but it's all about reproduction. So they lay their eggs where they were born. So if you don't kill them at some stage, then you're just going to have the explosion. You have a couple, then you have a couple more, then you have thousands of them. So there's not a nice way about it. Yes, ma'am.
You said I should add acid and phosphate to my grapes. Is that the humic? I mean, what am I adding?
That's the humic is the acid. And phosphate, you can get a superphosphate, or you can, I don't want to put this super bloom on it, or flower power, pardon me. We don't use the Miracle Grow words. That we don't, but because it's got too much nitrogen. You want to get the granular phosphate. You can go with bone meal or blood meal, but that's going to take a little while before it turns to phosphate. Yes, sir. Well, pay attention around them. I don't know if it's possible, but I had some that were growing over in this one bed next to the walkway, and I could tell I was not seeing the caterpillars when I would spot their dung on the sidewalk. Little bitty round black balls, and they'll just cut something off and sit down and eat it. If it's not a deer or something like that coming in and tasting it, then it's more than likely a night active critter, moth of some sort, or caterpillar. Oh, BT, caterpillar killer. It's something that has BT in it. This is, nature is a lot smarter than we give it credit for sometimes. Birds are not going to eat a sick or dying caterpillar. They just don't. Termites don't eat live trees. They eat the dead wood on a tree. So but if you spray, this is genetically specific for non-vertebrates. If you spray a caterpillar moth or any kind of moth or caterpillar, this will kill it, but it won't kill anything that eats it. Yep, it'll work for squash bugs. And those are the stink bugs, the little flat ones.
Yeah, they're kind of tannish with the wings.
Yeah. Yeah, in their pubescent stage, it'll work, but it's not going to kill the beetle-esque thing that you have. You're going to have to find something else, which I don't have up here right now. Just be careful of your oils this time of year. There's a horticulture oil that you want to be using on these in the fall and in the spring before they leaf out. It'll kill the eggs that are laid on the bark of your trees. And something that you cut back dramatically every couple of years, like your brambles, you'll have a bunch of dead wood in there at any given time, and there's eggs laid in there. And you can use the oils to suffocate them. Take out the dead wood first, and then spray everything else. Spray it when it goes dormant, and then spray it when you're working it in the spring. But don't be spraying it when it starts to warm up, anything that's heavy oil-based. Same thing with your soaps. It sounds kind. It's not. It's not good on your plants. It's, you know, you should not be drinking or eating joy. Yes, ma'am.